The big hotel looked like a palace that night. Bright lights shone from every window. Cars worth more money than most people make in a year pulled up to the front door. Men in expensive suits helped women in beautiful dresses step out onto the red carpet. This was the Grand Meridian Hotel, and tonight it was full of the richest people in the city. Maria Rodriguez walked quickly through the kitchen doors. She carried a heavy tray of glasses filled with golden champagne. The glasses were so expensive that just one cost more than she made in a day. She had to be very careful not to drop even one. Her black uniform was clean and pressed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked professional, but she felt invisible. The main ballroom was huge. Crystal lights hung from the high ceiling like frozen stars. Round tables covered with white cloth filled the room. Each table had fresh flowers that cost more than Maria's weekly food budget. The floors were so shiny she could see her reflection in them. Everything was perfect and expensive. Maria moved between the tables like a ghost. She served drinks and small pieces of fancy food to people who barely looked at her. When they did notice her, it was only to point at their empty glass or ask for something else. They talked over her head like she was not there. She was used to this. She had been working at the hotel for 3 years now. The guests were all important people. There were business owners who ran big companies. There were politicians who made laws for the city. There were doctors and lawyers and people who had so much money they never had to worry about paying bills. They wore clothes that cost thousands of dollars. The women had jewelry that sparkled like tiny stars. The men had watches that cost more than a car. Maria knew she did not belong in this world. She lived in a small apartment on the other side of town. The paint on the walls was old and peeling. Her bed was just a mattress on the floor. She had one small table, 2 chairs, and a tiny kitchen, but she also had something special hidden in the corner of her room. It was an old keyboard that she had bought from a pawn shop. It was her most precious thing. Every night after work, Maria would sit at that keyboard and play music. Her fingers would dance across the keys like they had a life of their own. She would play classical pieces that she had learned years ago. She would play jazz songs that made her heart feel happy. Sometimes she would make up her own music. The notes would flow from her fingers like water from a spring. But that was her secret life. Here at the hotel, she was just a waitress. She was someone who brought food and cleaned tables. She was someone who said yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, and tried to stay out of the way. She needed this job. She worked double shifts whenever she could. Every penny she earned went into a special jar in her kitchen. She was saving for something important. Tonight was special at the hotel. This was not just any dinner party. This was a charity event. All the rich people had paid $500 just for their dinner. The money would go to help music programs in the city schools. Kids who could not afford music lessons would get a chance to learn. It was a good cause, but Maria could never afford to buy a ticket to be a guest. She watched the people eat their expensive food. They talked about their big houses and their fancy vacations. They complained about problems that seemed small to Maria. Someone was upset because their new car was the wrong color. Another person was angry because their house cleaner came on the wrong day. Maria thought about her own problems. She worried about paying rent. She worried about buying enough food. She worried about having money for the bus to work. But Maria had dreams that were bigger than her small apartment. She had dreams that were bigger than this job. She had studied music in college for 2 years. She had been one of the best students in her class. Her teacher said she had a gift. She had a talent that could not be taught. But then her family had money problems. Her father got sick and could not work. Her mother needed help paying for medicine and doctor visits. Maria had to leave school and get a job. That was 5 years ago. Since then, she had worked hard every day. She sent money home to help her family. She saved what she could for herself. She never stopped practicing music even though she had no teacher and no school. She played her old keyboard until her fingers were sore. She listened to music on her phone and tried to learn new songs. She read books about music theory from the library. The ballroom was getting more crowded. More rich people arrived in their expensive clothes. They hugged each other and talked loudly about business deals and social events. Maria moved through them like she was part of the furniture. She smiled when she was supposed to smile. She said please and thank you at the right times. But inside her head, she was playing music. She looked at the stage at the front of the room. There was a beautiful black piano there. It was so shiny she could see the lights reflected in its surface. The piano was waiting for tonight's entertainment. Maria knew that a famous piano player was going to perform. His name was Marcus Sterling. She had seen his picture in magazines. He played for kings and presidents. He had made recordings that won important awards. Maria wondered what it would feel like to sit at that piano. She wondered what it would be like to play for all these important people, but she knew it was just a dream. She was a waitress. She served food and cleaned tables. She was not the kind of person who played piano at fancy events. The kitchen manager called her name. There were more drinks to serve. More important people needed attention. Maria picked up another tray and walked back into the crowd. She would keep working and saving money. Maybe someday she would have enough to go back to school. Maybe someday she would play piano for people who would really listen. But tonight she was just Maria the waitress. Tonight she was invisible to everyone except the people who needed something from her. She did not know that in just a few hours everything in her life would change forever. The dinner was almost over. Rich people pushed back their chairs and patted their full stomachs. They had eaten the most expensive food the hotel could make. Now it was time for the entertainment. This was what many of them had come to see. They were excited to hear Marcus Sterling play the piano. Maria was cleaning tables near the back of the room. She picked up empty wine glasses and dirty plates. She tried to work quietly so she would not disturb the guests. But she was also listening carefully. She loved to hear good music even when she had to work at the same time. The lights in the room got dimmer. A spotlight shone on the beautiful black piano on the stage. People stopped talking and turned to look. A man in a perfect black suit walked onto the stage. This was Marcus Sterling. He was older than Maria had expected. His hair was gray at the sides, but his hands looked strong and sure. Marcus Sterling was famous all over the world. He had played piano since he was a small child. He had studied at the best music schools. He had played in the biggest concert halls in every country. Rich people paid thousands of dollars just to hear him play. Tonight he was doing this concert for free because it was for charity. The famous pianist sat down at the piano bench. He adjusted his position carefully. He placed his hands over the keys but did not touch them yet. The room was completely quiet. Even the waiters and cooks stopped working to listen. Maria put down her tray and stood still. Marcus Sterling began to play. The music that came from the piano was beautiful. It was a piece by Chopin, a composer who had died long ago but whose music still made people cry. The notes were soft at first, like raindrops on a window. Then they got louder and more passionate. It was like the piano was telling a story about love and loss and hope. Maria knew this piece of music. She had played it many times on her old keyboard at home, but hearing it played on a real piano by a master was different. It was like seeing a painting in a museum instead of in a book. Every note was perfect. Every phrase had meaning. The music filled the huge room and touched everyone who heard it. The rich people in their fancy clothes forgot about their business deals and their money. They forgot about their problems and their schedules. They just listened to the beautiful music. Some of them had tears in their eyes. This was why music was so powerful. It could reach into people's hearts no matter who they were. Maria watched Marcus Sterling's hands as he played. His fingers moved like dancers across the keys. He made it look easy, but Maria knew how hard it was to play like that. She had practiced for hours every day when she was in music school. She knew how much work it took to make music sound so effortless. The piece was almost finished. Marcus Sterling's hands moved faster now. The music built up to the big ending. Everyone in the room was holding their breath. Then something terrible happened. Marcus Sterling stopped playing. His right hand flew up from the keys like something had hurt him. He grabbed his wrist with his other hand. His face showed pain. The beautiful music stopped in the middle of a phrase. The silence was shocking after the lovely sounds. People in the audience did not know what to do. They looked at each other with confused faces. Was this part of the performance? Was the pianist sick? What was happening? Marcus Sterling tried to put his hand back on the keys, but when he moved his fingers, he winced with pain. Something was wrong with his wrist. Maybe he had hurt it before the concert. Maybe the pain had been getting worse while he played. Now he could not continue. Two men in hotel uniforms rushed onto the stage. They helped Marcus Sterling stand up from the piano bench. He was a proud man, and he did not like needing help. But the pain in his wrist was too much. He could not play anymore. The event coordinator ran onto the stage too. Her name was Mrs. Patterson, and she had planned this whole evening. She had worked for months to make everything perfect. Now the main entertainment was ruined. She looked worried and confused. Mrs. Patterson spoke quietly to Marcus Sterling. He shook his head sadly. He pointed to his wrist and said something Maria could not hear. Then the two hotel workers helped him walk off the stage. The famous pianist was gone and the piano sat empty and silent. The people in the audience started talking loudly. They were confused and disappointed. They had paid a lot of money to hear Marcus Sterling play. Some of them looked angry. Others looked worried about the pianist's health. But everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Mrs. Patterson stood alone on the stage next to the piano. She looked scared. She had to tell all these important people that the evening's entertainment was over. These were people who gave money to the charity every year. If they were unhappy, they might not give money again next year. She picked up the microphone with shaking hands. Her voice was not steady when she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "I am sorry to tell you that Mr. Sterling has hurt his wrist. He cannot continue playing tonight." The crowd made disappointed sounds. Some people stood up like they were going to leave. Others shook their heads and talked to their friends. The beautiful evening was falling apart. Mrs. Patterson kept talking. "We are very sorry for this problem. We will try to find another piano player. Please be patient with us." But everyone could hear in her voice that she did not think this was possible. Who could replace Marcus Sterling? What piano player would be at a hotel on a Saturday night? Maria watched all this happen from the back of the room. She felt sorry for Mrs. Patterson. She felt sorry for the people who had paid money to hear music. She felt sorry for Marcus Sterling, whose hurt wrist had ruined his performance. But most of all, she felt the music in her own heart. The Chopin piece was not finished. It ended in the wrong place at the wrong time. The melody was hanging in the air like a question without an answer. Maria's fingers moved without her thinking about it. She was playing the rest of the piece on an invisible piano. She knew exactly how it was supposed to end. Mrs. Patterson was still on the stage looking helpless. She was asking if anyone in the audience could play piano. But these were business people and politicians and social leaders. They might have taken piano lessons when they were children, but they were not performers. No one raised their hand. The evening was dying. Soon people would start leaving. The charity would lose money. The music programs for children would get less help. All because one man's wrist was hurt and no one else could play the piano. But there was someone else who could play. Someone who knew the Chopin piece by heart. Someone who had dreamed of playing on a real piano for real people. Someone who was standing in the back of the room in a waitress uniform, invisible to everyone. Maria Rodriguez knew she could finish the piece. She knew she could save the evening. But did she have the courage to step forward? Did she dare to walk from the shadows into the bright lights on the stage? Maria's heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She stood at the back of the ballroom holding an empty tray. Her hands were shaking a little. The room was full of worried voices and disappointed faces. Mrs. Patterson was still on the stage looking lost and scared. In her mind, Maria could hear the rest of the Chopin piece. The notes were as clear as if someone was playing them right next to her. She had practiced this music so many times on her old keyboard. She knew every note, every pause, every soft touch and strong accent. The melody was part of her now, but knowing the music and playing it for hundreds of rich strangers were two very different things. Maria was just a waitress. She served food and cleaned tables. She was not supposed to be the center of attention. She was supposed to stay invisible and do her job quietly. She thought about her tiny apartment and her old keyboard. Every night after work, she would sit in her small room and play music. The walls were thin, so she had to play softly so the neighbors would not complain. Sometimes she would close her eyes and pretend she was playing in a big concert hall. She would imagine people listening and clapping. But it was always just a dream. Now the dream was right in front of her. There was a real piano on a real stage with real people waiting to hear music. But dreams and reality were different things. Dreams were safe. Reality was scary. Maria looked around the room at all the important people. They wore clothes that cost more than she made in months. They lived in big houses and drove expensive cars. They went to the best schools and had important jobs. What would they think if a waitress tried to play piano for them? Would they laugh at her? Would they be angry? Would they think she was crazy? Mrs. Patterson was talking to some other hotel workers on the stage. They were shaking their heads. Maria could see they had no ideas. They were going to have to tell everyone to go home. The evening would be ruined. The charity would lose money. Children would not get music lessons because there was no one to play the piano. Maria's hands were moving again. She was playing the invisible piano without thinking about it. Her fingers knew exactly where each note should be. She had practiced this piece so many times that her hands could play it while she was sleeping. The music was in her blood and her bones. She thought about her music teacher from college. Professor Williams was a kind woman who had believed in Maria's talent. She had told Maria that music was a gift that was meant to be shared. "You cannot keep beautiful music locked inside you," Professor Williams had said. "It is selfish to hide your gift from the world." But Maria had been hiding her gift for 5 years now. She played alone in her room where no one could hear. She was afraid to let anyone know she could make music. She was afraid they would expect too much from her. She was afraid she would disappoint them. The voices in the ballroom were getting louder. Some people were starting to stand up. They were getting ready to leave. Soon the beautiful room would be empty. The piano would sit silent and alone. The evening would be remembered as a failure. Maria made a decision. Her legs felt weak, but she started walking toward the front of the room. She left her tray on an empty table. She walked past the rich people in their fancy clothes. Some of them looked at her with curious eyes. Why was a waitress walking toward the stage? With each step, Maria's heart beat faster. Her mouth felt dry. Her hands were sweating. But she kept walking. The music in her head was getting louder. The Chopin piece was calling to her, asking to be finished, asking to be heard. She reached the edge of the stage where Mrs. Patterson was standing. The event coordinator was talking on her phone, trying to find another piano player. She looked desperate and tired. Maria stood there for a moment, trying to find her voice. "Excuse me," Maria said quietly. Her voice was so soft that Mrs. Patterson did not hear her. "Excuse me," Maria said again, a little louder. Mrs. Patterson looked down at her. The woman's face was red with stress. Her perfect hair was starting to come undone. She looked at Maria like she was annoyed to be interrupted. "What is it?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Can't you see I'm busy? We have a serious problem here." Maria's voice was shaking, but she forced herself to speak. "I can play the piano," she said. Mrs. Patterson stared at her like she had said something crazy. "What did you say?" "I can play the piano," Maria repeated. "I can finish the piece that Mr. Sterling was playing. I can play other pieces, too." Mrs. Patterson looked at Maria's waitress uniform. She looked at her simple ponytail and her plain face. She looked confused and maybe a little angry. "This is not a joke," Mrs. Patterson said. "We have very important people here. They expect professional entertainment. You are a waitress." Maria felt her face get hot. She wanted to run away and hide, but the music in her head would not let her give up. "I studied music in college," Maria said. "I know the Chopin piece. I can play it perfectly. Please let me try." Mrs. Patterson looked around the room. More people were standing up now. Some were putting on their coats. The evening was falling apart in front of her eyes. She had planned everything so carefully. She had worked so hard to make it perfect. Now a waitress was offering to save it. "Do you really know how to play piano?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Her voice was desperate now. "Yes," Maria said. "I have been playing since I was 6 years old. I studied at the music college for 2 years. I practice every day. I promise I can do this." Mrs. Patterson looked at the piano sitting empty on the stage. She looked at the crowd of unhappy rich people. She looked back at Maria's honest face. She had no other choice. "If you embarrass me, you will lose your job," Mrs. Patterson said. "Do you understand that?" Maria nodded. "I understand. But I will not embarrass you. I will make beautiful music." Mrs. Patterson closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked like a woman jumping off a cliff. "What is your name?" she asked. "Maria Rodriguez." "Okay, Maria Rodriguez. God help us both." Mrs. Patterson picked up the microphone. Her hand was shaking. The crowd was noisy and restless. People were talking loudly and moving around. Mrs. Patterson tapped on the microphone to get their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said. Her voice echoed through the big room. "Please take your seats. We have found someone to continue our musical program tonight." People stopped moving and looked at the stage. They seemed surprised and curious. Who could possibly replace Marcus Sterling? "I would like to introduce Miss Maria Rodriguez," Mrs. Patterson said. She looked down at Maria and nodded. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. Maria walked up the steps onto the stage. The lights were so bright she could barely see the audience. Her legs felt like water. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She walked across the stage toward the beautiful black piano. It looked even bigger up close. The keys were perfect white and black rectangles waiting for her touch. This was not her old keyboard with some broken keys and scratches. This was a real concert piano worth more money than she would make in her whole life. Maria sat down on the piano bench. She adjusted her position just like she had seen Marcus Sterling do. She placed her hands over the keys but did not touch them yet. The room was getting quiet as people sat back down. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. Important people were waiting to see what this waitress could do. Some of them looked curious. Others looked doubtful. A few looked annoyed that their evening had been interrupted by someone so ordinary. Maria closed her eyes for just a moment. She thought about her grandmother, who had first taught her to love music. She thought about Professor Williams, who had believed in her talent. She thought about all the nights she had played alone in her room, dreaming of this moment. When she opened her eyes, she was ready. The scared waitress was gone. Now there was only Maria the musician. She touched the keys, and the most beautiful sound she had ever heard came from the piano. The music began. The first note that came from the piano was perfect. It was clear and strong and beautiful. Maria's finger had touched the key with just the right amount of pressure. The sound filled the big ballroom like magic, but the people in the audience did not know what to think yet. They saw a young woman in a waitress uniform sitting at the piano, where a famous musician had been just minutes before. Some of them whispered to each other. Others shook their heads like they could not believe what was happening. Maria could feel their doubt. She could sense their confusion. These rich, important people had paid good money to hear professional music. Now they were looking at someone who had been serving their dinner. She knew they were thinking this was a mistake. They were thinking she would embarrass herself and ruin their evening even more. Her hands were still shaking a little, but she placed them on the keys anyway. She started playing exactly where Marcus Sterling had stopped. The melody picked up like it had never been interrupted. The notes flowed from her fingers like water from a spring. At first, the music was soft and gentle. Maria was finding her way, getting used to this piano. It was so different from her old keyboard at home. This piano had a voice that was rich and deep. Every key responded to her touch with perfect sound. It was like the difference between singing in a small room and singing in a great cathedral. The people in the audience stopped whispering. They leaned forward in their chairs. Something was happening that they had not expected. This waitress was not just playing the right notes. She was making real music. Maria forgot about the crowd watching her. She forgot about her waitress uniform and her nervousness. She forgot about everything except the music. The Chopin piece was alive under her fingers. Each note had its own personality. Each phrase told part of a story about love and sadness and beauty. Her confidence grew with every measure. Her hands moved more surely across the keys. The music got stronger and more passionate. She was not just finishing the piece that Marcus Sterling had started. She was making it her own. The people in fancy clothes began to realize they were hearing something special. This was not just correct piano playing. This was art. The young woman at the piano was not just a waitress who happened to know how to play. She was a real musician. A man in an expensive suit leaned over to his wife. "She's quite good," he whispered. His wife nodded, her eyes fixed on Maria's flying fingers. A woman with diamond earrings stopped checking her phone. She put it in her purse and gave all her attention to the music. She had heard many famous piano players, but there was something different about this performance, something more honest and emotional. Maria played the ending of the Chopin piece with perfect skill. The last notes rang out in the silent ballroom. For a moment, no one moved. The music had been so beautiful that people needed time to return to the real world. Then something amazing happened. Instead of stopping, Maria began to play another piece. She moved smoothly from Chopin into something else. It was a Spanish melody that her grandmother had hummed when Maria was a little girl. But Maria had arranged it for piano, making it more complex and beautiful. The audience was surprised but pleased. They had expected the music to end, but now they were getting more. And this new piece was different from the classical Chopin. It had the warmth of Spanish sunshine and the passion of flamenco dancing. It told a story about family and tradition and love. Maria's fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence. She was not just playing music now. She was sharing pieces of her life. The Spanish melody reminded her of her grandmother's small kitchen, where the old woman would cook and hum while Maria played on a toy piano. From the Spanish piece, Maria moved into jazz. This was music she had learned working in hotel lounges and small restaurants. It was American music with African roots, music that spoke about struggle and hope and finding joy in difficult times. Her left hand played a steady rhythm while her right hand improvised melodies that seemed to come from her heart. The rich people in the audience had never heard jazz played like this. They knew famous jazz musicians from recordings and concerts. But Maria's jazz was different. It was more personal, more real. She was not trying to impress anyone with fancy tricks. She was just telling her story through music. A young businessman put down his wine glass and stopped talking to his friends. He had never paid much attention to music before, but something about Maria's playing made him listen. The jazz rhythm seemed to speak directly to his soul. An elderly woman who had given money to music programs for many years felt tears in her eyes. She had heard hundreds of concerts, but she had never heard anyone play with such pure emotion. This waitress was not performing for money or fame. She was sharing her gift because she loved music. Maria continued playing, moving from one style to another like she was painting with sound. She played a little bit of classical music from the great masters. She played some modern pieces that she had learned from recordings. She even played some original melodies that she had composed in her small apartment. Each piece showed a different side of her musical knowledge. The audience began to realize that this young woman was not just talented. She was educated. She was skilled. She was a serious musician who happened to work as a waitress. Mrs. Patterson stood at the side of the stage, watching in amazement. She had taken a huge risk letting Maria play. She could have lost her job if this had gone badly. But now she was watching a miracle happen. The disappointed audience was becoming enchanted. The failed evening was becoming magical. The hotel manager came to stand next to Mrs. Patterson. He was a stern man who rarely showed emotion. But even he was impressed by what he was hearing. "Where did she learn to play like that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Mrs. Patterson replied. "She's been working here for 3 years and I never knew she could make music." On the stage, Maria was lost in her own world. She played piece after piece, each one showing different emotions and different memories. She played music that was sad and music that was joyful. She played songs that reminded her of rainy days and songs that felt like sunshine. The audience was completely quiet now. Even the waiters and kitchen staff had stopped working to listen. Everyone in the building was under the spell of Maria's music. She had transformed the ballroom into a concert hall and herself from a servant into an artist. But Maria was not finished yet. She had more music to share. She had more of her story to tell. Her fingers found the keys for one more piece, something that would show everyone who she really was inside. As she began to play this final selection, Maria knew that her life would never be the same again. The scared waitress who had walked onto the stage was disappearing forever. In her place was a musician who was ready to share her gift with the world. The spotlight shone down on her like a blessing. The beautiful piano sang under her hands like a living thing. And the room full of strangers became an audience of friends, all connected by the universal language of music. Maria played on, pouring her heart into every note, knowing that this moment would change everything. Maria's final piece began with a single haunting note. It hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer. Then her left hand joined in with a gentle rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. This was her own composition, a song she had written during the darkest time in her life. She had created this music 2 years ago when her father was very sick. The family had no money for doctors or medicine. Maria was working double shifts at the hotel, sending every penny home. She would come back to her tiny apartment exhausted and worried. That was when she wrote this piece, pouring all her fear and hope into the melody. The music started quietly like whispered prayers. Maria's fingers moved gently across the keys, creating sounds that spoke of worry and sadness. But there was something else in the music too. There was love. There was determination. There was the strength that comes from caring deeply about other people. The audience listened with growing amazement. This was not music they had heard before. This was not a famous composer's work that they could recognize and name. This was something new, something personal, something that came straight from the heart of the young woman at the piano. As the piece developed, the melody grew stronger. Maria's right hand played notes that climbed higher and higher, like hope rising from despair. The music spoke about working hard and never giving up. It spoke about believing in dreams even when everything seems impossible. A woman in the audience wiped tears from her eyes. She was a successful businesswoman who had worked her way up from nothing. She recognized the struggle in Maria's music because she had lived it herself. The melody reminded her of her own journey from poverty to wealth. The music changed again, becoming more complex. Maria's hands moved independently, creating layers of sound that wove together like a beautiful tapestry. Her left hand played the steady rhythm of daily work. The same patterns repeated over and over. Her right hand soared above it with melodies that represented dreams and ambitions. This was the story of every person who had ever worked hard for a better life. It was the story of immigrants who came to a new country with nothing but hope. It was the story of students who studied by candlelight because they could not afford electricity. It was the story of anyone who had ever believed that music, art, or education could change their life. A young man in the audience leaned forward in his chair. He was the son of rich parents, and he had never had to struggle for anything. But Maria's music was teaching him something about courage and determination that he had never learned in his comfortable life. The melody built to a powerful climax. Maria's hands moved faster now, creating cascades of notes that sounded like joy breaking free from a cage. This was the moment in the song when hope wins over fear. This was when dreams become stronger than obstacles. But then the music became sad again. Maria played slow, mournful notes that spoke of loss and disappointment. This part of her composition was about her father's death last year. Despite all her work and all the money she sent home, he had died anyway. The doctors had done everything they could, but it was not enough. The audience felt the grief in the music. Even people who had never lost anyone important could understand the pain in those notes. Maria's playing was so honest and emotional that it reached into everyone's heart. A businessman who had been checking his phone put it away and gave his full attention to the music. He thought about his own father, who had died when the businessman was young. He had not thought about that loss for years, but Maria's music brought the memories flooding back. The sad section of the music slowly transformed into something else. The grief was still there, but now it was mixed with acceptance and even gratitude. Maria played melodies that spoke about how love continues even after someone dies. The music said that the people we lose continue to live in our hearts and in our memories. This was the most difficult part of the piece for Maria to play. Every time she performed this section, she thought about her father's last words to her. He had told her never to give up on her music. He had said that her talent was a gift that she owed to the world. Maria's playing became even more expressive. She made the piano sing with emotions that had no words. The instrument responded to every touch of her fingers, creating sounds that were sometimes gentle like a lullaby and sometimes powerful like thunder. The audience was completely captivated. These were people who were used to entertainment that cost thousands of dollars. They had heard world-famous orchestras and opera singers, but none of those performances had touched them the way this waitress's music was touching them now. An elderly man who had donated millions of dollars to music programs over the years sat with his mouth open in amazement. He had thought he understood what music could do, but Maria was showing him possibilities he had never imagined. The composition moved into its final section. Maria played notes that sparkled like stars, melodies that soared like birds in flight. This was the part of the song about hope for the future. This was about believing that better days would come. This was about the power of music to heal wounds and lift spirits. Her hands danced across the keys with incredible skill. She played runs and arpeggios that would have been difficult for any professional pianist. But she made them sound effortless, like she was simply speaking in her native language. The music grew louder and more triumphant. Maria was telling the audience that no matter how hard life becomes, there is always reason to hope. No matter how many obstacles stand in the way, dreams can still come true. The melody soared higher and higher, carrying everyone in the room with it. A woman who ran a large charity felt her heart racing with excitement. She realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. This was not just a musical performance. This was a demonstration of the human spirit refusing to be defeated. As the piece neared its end, Maria played with every ounce of emotion she possessed. She thought about her journey from that scared college student who had to drop out of school to this moment, sitting at a grand piano in front of hundreds of important people. The final notes of her composition rang out in the silent ballroom. They seemed to hang in the air forever, beautiful and pure and perfect. When the last sound finally faded away, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was so complete that Maria could hear her own breathing. She had finished. She had played her heart out for these strangers. She had shared her most personal music with people who had never noticed her before tonight. Now she sat at the piano bench, suddenly aware again of her waitress uniform and her simple appearance. Maria looked out at the audience for the first time since she had started playing. Hundreds of faces stared back at her. But these were not the same faces that had doubted her when she first walked onto the stage. These were faces filled with wonder and respect and something that looked like awe. The silence stretched on and on. Maria began to worry. Had she done something wrong? Had her music been too personal, too emotional? Should she have played safer, more familiar pieces? Then slowly one person began to clap. The first person to clap was an elderly woman sitting in the front row. She had silver hair and wore a simple black dress with pearls. Her hands came together slowly, making a soft sound in the quiet room. Her eyes were bright with tears and she was smiling like she had just witnessed a miracle. For a moment, she was the only one clapping. The sound of her hands seemed very small in the huge ballroom. But then something magical happened. One by one, other people began to join her. A man in an expensive suit started clapping. Then his wife joined him. Then the couple at the next table. Then a whole section of the room. The applause grew like a wave spreading across water, reaching every corner of the ballroom. But this was not ordinary clapping. This was the kind of applause that comes from deep in the heart. People were not just being polite or following social rules. They were expressing something much more powerful. They were showing their amazement and gratitude for what they had just experienced. Maria sat at the piano bench watching this happen with wide eyes. She had never heard applause like this before. When she was in college, she had played for small audiences of students and teachers. They had clapped nicely when she finished. But this was different. This applause felt like love. The clapping got louder and stronger. People were not just using their hands anymore. Some of them were standing up. An important businessman who had been checking his phone all evening stood and applauded with enthusiasm. A woman who ran a major corporation wiped tears from her cheeks as she clapped. More and more people rose to their feet. The standing ovation spread through the room like wildfire. Soon nearly everyone was standing and clapping and cheering. The sound was incredible, like thunder rolling through the ballroom. Maria could not believe what was happening. These rich, sophisticated people were giving her the kind of reception usually reserved for world-famous artists. She was still wearing her waitress uniform. She was still the same person who had been serving their dinner an hour ago. But somehow the music had changed everything. Mrs. Patterson stood at the side of the stage with tears streaming down her face. She had taken a huge risk letting Maria play. She could have been fired if this had gone badly. But now she was watching the most successful musical performance in the hotel's history. The audience was on their feet, applauding louder than she had ever heard. The hotel manager stood next to Mrs. Patterson, shaking his head in amazement. In 30 years of working in the hospitality business, he had never seen anything like this. Famous entertainers had performed in this ballroom before, celebrity musicians, Broadway stars, opera singers, but none of them had received this kind of response. The applause continued for what felt like forever. People were not getting tired of clapping. If anything, they were clapping harder. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Others were smiling so widely their faces hurt. A few were cheering and shouting, "Bravo," like they were at the opera. Maria finally stood up from the piano bench. She was not sure what she was supposed to do. She had never been the center of attention like this before. She gave a small, shy bow, the way she had seen musicians do in videos. This made the audience clap even louder. A man near the front shouted, "More! Please play more." Soon other voices joined him. "Encore!" someone called out. "Don't stop!" shouted another person. The audience wanted Maria to keep playing. They were not ready for this magical evening to end. Maria looked out at all the faces turned toward her. These were some of the most powerful people in the city. They owned businesses and made important decisions. They had influence and money and social status. But right now they were asking a waitress to please share more of her music with them. She sat back down at the piano. The audience immediately became quiet, eager to hear what she would play next. Maria thought for a moment about what these people might want to hear. Then she decided to play something that would include everyone in the room. She began to play Amazing Grace, the old hymn that almost everyone knew. But she played it in her own special way, with jazz harmonies and classical techniques. The familiar melody became something new and beautiful under her hands. Some people in the audience began to hum along softly. Others swayed gently to the rhythm. The music brought back memories for many of them. They remembered learning this song as children. They remembered singing it in church or at family gatherings. Maria's version honored the original while making it fresh and modern. After Amazing Grace, Maria played a medley of songs that told the story of America. She included Danny Boy for the Irish immigrants who had built the city. She played La Cucaracha for the Mexican families who had come looking for work. She added bits of blues and gospel and country music, creating a musical map of all the different people who had made this country their home. The audience recognized what she was doing. She was celebrating their diversity while bringing them together through music. Rich and poor, young and old, people from different backgrounds and beliefs, all united by the universal language of melody and rhythm. A young woman who worked for a technology company realized she was crying. She came from a family of immigrants, and Maria's music reminded her of her grandparents' stories about coming to America with nothing but hope and determination. And an older man who had been born into wealth thought about his ancestors, who had arrived on ships centuries ago. They had been poor and frightened too, looking for a better life in a new land. Maria's music connected him to those long-ago relatives in a way he had never felt before. As Maria played, she felt the room changing around her. The invisible barriers between the servers and the served were dissolving. The differences between rich and poor, educated and working class, important and ordinary, were becoming less significant. Music was doing what it did best, reminding everyone that they were all human beings with similar hopes and dreams. A woman who owned several restaurants thought about her own employees. How many of them had hidden talents that she had never bothered to discover? How many stories were walking around her businesses every day, unnoticed and unheard? Maria's medley came to an end with a gentle version of Home on the Range, a song about finding peace and belonging. The last notes faded away, and once again the room fell silent. But this silence was different from before. It was not awkward or uncertain. It was the silence of people who had shared something profound together. Then the applause began again, even stronger than before. The standing ovation seemed to shake the walls of the building. People were not just clapping now. They were cheering and calling out words of appreciation. Beautiful. Incredible. Thank you. Maria stood and bowed again, deeper this time. She was beginning to understand that she had given these people something valuable. She had shared not just her musical skill, but her heart and her story. She had reminded them why music mattered, why art was important, why human creativity was worth supporting. The applause went on and on. It seemed like it might never stop. People did not want this moment to end. They did not want to return to their ordinary lives where waitresses were invisible and music came from recordings or hired professionals. Finally, Mrs. Patterson walked onto the stage. She had to gesture for quiet several times before the audience settled down enough for her to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, her voice shaking with emotion, "I think we can all agree that we have witnessed something very special tonight. Please join me in thanking Miss Maria Rodriguez for her extraordinary performance." The applause erupted again, louder than ever. Maria smiled and waved, still hardly believing this was really happening to her. Just a few hours ago, she had been worried about paying her rent. Now she was receiving the kind of ovation that most musicians only dream about. But the evening was not over yet. The most amazing part was still to come. The applause seemed to have a life of its own. It rolled through the ballroom like thunder, growing stronger instead of weaker. People were not just clapping politely anymore. They were expressing pure joy and amazement. Some were wiping tears from their eyes while they clapped. Others were smiling so widely that their faces glowed with happiness. Maria stood on the stage, overwhelmed by the response. She had dreamed of moments like this when she was alone in her small apartment, playing her old keyboard. But her dreams had never been as powerful as this reality. The sound of hundreds of people showing their appreciation was almost too much to believe. An elderly gentleman in the front row was clapping so hard his hands were turning red. He was a retired music teacher who had spent his life helping children learn to play instruments. In all his years of teaching and attending concerts, he had rarely heard anything as moving as Maria's performance. Next to him, a young mother thought about her own daughter, who was taking piano lessons. She made a mental note to encourage the child to keep practicing, even when it was difficult. Maria's story showed what was possible when talent met determination and hard work. The hotel staff had stopped all their work to watch and listen. Waiters stood in doorways with empty trays in their hands. Kitchen workers came out to see what was happening. Even the security guards were clapping. Maria was one of them, and her success felt like a victory for all the invisible workers who kept the hotel running. Mrs. Patterson tried several times to quiet the audience so the evening could continue, but people did not want the applause to end. Every time it started to die down, someone would shout, "Bravo!" and the clapping would surge back to life. A businessman who owned several companies was clapping harder than anyone around him. He was thinking about all the employees he had never really noticed. How many of them had amazing talents that they kept hidden? How many stories of struggle and triumph were walking through his offices every day without him knowing? The standing ovation had been going on for almost 10 minutes now. This was longer than most professional concerts received, longer than famous singers got at the opera house. But the audience was not tired. If anything, they seemed energized by their own enthusiasm. Maria tried to leave the stage several times, but each attempt made the audience clap louder. They wanted her to stay. They wanted to keep showing their appreciation for what she had shared with them. Finally, she sat back down at the piano bench, thinking they might want her to play more. But when she placed her hands on the keys, the audience became quiet immediately. They thought she was going to perform another piece. Instead, Maria stood up and walked to the microphone that Mrs. Patterson had left on the stage. Her voice was shaky when she spoke. She was not used to talking to large groups of people, especially important ones, but she felt she needed to say something. "Thank you," she said simply. Her words echoed through the room. "Thank you so much for listening to my music." This started a new wave of applause, but Maria held up her hand gently, asking for quiet. She had more to say. "I want you to know that tonight has been the most amazing night of my life," she continued. "For 3 years I have worked in this hotel. I have served your food and cleaned your tables. Most of the time I felt invisible. The room was completely quiet now. People were hanging on every word. But music has always been my dream. Every night after work, I go home to my small apartment and play piano on an old keyboard. I practice and practice, hoping that someday I might get a chance like this." A woman in the audience felt her heart breaking and healing at the same time. She realized how many dreams were working around her every day, invisible and unrecognized. "I want to thank Mrs. Patterson for giving me this chance," Maria continued. "She took a big risk letting a waitress play piano for all of you important people. She could have lost her job if I had failed." Mrs. Patterson smiled through her tears. She had indeed taken a huge risk, but it had turned out to be the best decision of her career. "Most of all," Maria said, "I want to thank all of you for listening with your hearts. You could have walked out when you saw a waitress sitting at the piano. But you stayed. You listened. You made me feel like my music mattered." The audience was completely still. Some people were crying openly now. Maria's words were as moving as her music had been. "The charity tonight is for music education for children who cannot afford lessons. I was one of those children once. A kind teacher gave me my first piano lesson for free. That is why I am standing here tonight." A man who had donated money to the charity every year for decades realized he had never thought about the individual children who benefited from his contributions. Now he was seeing the face of one of those children, grown up and sharing her gift with the world. "Music saved my life," Maria said. "It gave me hope when things were dark. It gave me joy when I was sad. It gave me a way to express feelings that I could not put into words. Every child deserves a chance to find that kind of magic." The applause started again, but it was different this time. It was not just appreciation for Maria's musical talent. It was recognition of her courage, her honesty, and her message about the power of music to change lives. Maria waved goodbye and walked toward the steps leading off the stage. But the audience would not let her go. The applause got louder and more insistent. People were calling her name now. "Maria, Maria. Maria?" She turned back and bowed one more time. The response was so enthusiastic that the chandeliers seemed to shake. People were not just clapping now. They were cheering and whistling and stamping their feet. A young girl who had come to the event with her parents pushed forward through the crowd. She was about 10 years old and took piano lessons at school. She wanted to tell Maria that her performance had inspired her to practice harder and never give up on her dreams. The girl's parents followed her, amazed by their daughter's enthusiasm. They had brought her to the charity event, hoping she would understand the importance of supporting music education. They had never expected her to witness such a powerful example of what music education could accomplish. More people began moving toward the stage. They wanted to meet Maria personally, to thank her for the gift she had given them. The formal charity dinner was turning into something much more personal and meaningful. A famous conductor who had been in the audience pushed through the crowd. He wanted to talk to Maria about performing with his orchestra. A recording company executive was looking for her business card, though of course she did not have one. A wealthy patron of the arts was already planning to sponsor Maria's return to music school. But Maria did not know about any of these opportunities yet. She was still overwhelmed by the applause, which continued even as people began to move around and talk to each other. The standing ovation had lasted almost 15 minutes now, longer than anyone could remember at any event in the city. Finally, Mrs. Patterson took control of the situation. She returned to the stage and spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know you would like to continue showing your appreciation for Miss Rodriguez's incredible performance, but let us allow her to come down from the stage so those of you who wish to speak with her can do so personally." This announcement caused the formal applause to end, but it was immediately replaced by excited conversations and the sound of people moving toward the stage area. The evening had transformed from a typical charity dinner into something extraordinary and unforgettable. As Maria walked down the steps from the stage, she was surrounded by people wanting to shake her hand and talk to her. But she was about to discover that the standing ovation was just the beginning of how this one performance would change her entire life. As Maria stepped down from the stage, she was immediately surrounded by excited people. They wanted to shake her hand, get her phone number, and tell her how much her music had moved them. She felt dizzy from all the attention. Just an hour ago, these same people had looked right through her when she served their drinks. A well-dressed woman with kind eyes pushed through the crowd first. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, the director of the city's most prestigious music conservatory. Her voice was urgent and excited. "Miss Rodriguez, your performance tonight was extraordinary. I would like to offer you a full scholarship to finish your music degree. We have never made an offer like this based on one performance, but your talent is undeniable." Maria's eyes filled with tears. A full scholarship meant she could quit her waitressing job and focus completely on music. It meant she could study with the best teachers and have access to practice rooms with real pianos. It was everything she had dreamed about during those lonely nights in her small apartment. Before Maria could answer, a man in an expensive suit stepped forward. He handed her a business card with gold letters. "I'm James Wilson from Classical Records. We would like to discuss a recording contract with you. Your original composition tonight was remarkable. The world needs to hear your music." Maria stared at the business card like it was made of magic. A recording contract meant her music could reach people all over the world. It meant she could make a living doing what she loved most. More people pressed forward with offers and opportunities. A famous piano teacher wanted to give her private lessons. A concert promoter wanted to book her for performances in other cities. A wealthy philanthropist offered to sponsor her career development. Mrs. Patterson watched all this happening with amazement and pride. She had known Maria was a good employee, but she had never imagined the young woman possessed such incredible talent. She felt honored to have been the one who gave Maria her first real chance to shine. The hotel manager approached Mrs. Patterson with a big smile. "That was the most successful charity event we have ever hosted," he told her. "The donors are so inspired that they have already pledged twice as much money as we expected to raise tonight." Indeed, the evening had been a huge success for the charity. People were writing larger checks than they had planned. Maria's story about music education changing her life had reminded everyone why this cause was so important. Children all over the city would benefit from the extra money raised that night. A reporter from the city newspaper was taking pictures and asking questions. She wanted to write a story about the waitress who had amazed the elite with her hidden talent. A photographer from a magazine was already planning a photo shoot. But the most meaningful moment came when a young girl pushed through the adults to reach Maria. She was about 12 years old, with bright eyes and a shy smile. Miss Maria, the girl said quietly. I take piano lessons at school, but sometimes I want to quit because it's hard. After hearing you play tonight, I promise I will never give up. Thank you for showing me what is possible. Maria knelt down to the girl's level and took her small hands. What is your name, sweetheart? Isabella, the girl replied. Isabella, practicing piano is hard work, but it is also a gift you give to yourself. Every time you practice, you are building something beautiful inside you. Promise me you will keep playing no matter what. Isabella nodded seriously. I promise. And someday I want to play as beautifully as you do. This conversation meant more to Maria than all the business offers and opportunities. This was why music mattered. This was why she had taken the risk to step onto that stage. The crowd around Maria continued to grow. People who had been strangers an hour ago were now excited to be part of her story. They took pictures with her and asked her to sign their programs. From the evening, a local television station arrived to interview Maria. The reporter asked her how it felt to go from serving dinner to being the star of the evening. It feels like a dream, Maria answered honestly, but it also feels like coming home. Music has always been my real life. Tonight, I finally got to share that life with other people. The interview was broadcast on the late news that night. By morning, the video had been shared thousands of times on social media. People all over the country were watching the waitress who had stunned a ballroom full of rich people with her incredible piano playing. Record companies from other cities called wanting to hear more of her music. Concert halls offered her performance opportunities. Music schools invited her to give masterclasses to their students. But Maria's life had changed in ways that went beyond career opportunities. The wealthy people who had been at the dinner began to see their own employees differently. The businessman who owned several companies started asking his workers about their interests and dreams. The woman who ran restaurants began offering music during employee break times. Mrs. Patterson was promoted to special events director at the hotel. Her willingness to take a risk with Maria had impressed the management and brought great publicity to the business. 6 months later, Maria returned to the Grand Meridian Hotel, but this time she was not wearing a waitress uniform. She was dressed in a beautiful gown, and she was the featured performer at another charity event. As she sat at the same piano where her life had changed, Maria looked out at the audience. She saw many of the same faces that had been there that first night. But she also saw new faces, including some hotel employees who had been given special invitations to attend. Among the staff members was Isabella, the young girl who had promised never to give up piano. She was there with her parents, who had been able to afford better music lessons thanks to the scholarship fund that had been created in Maria's honor. Before Maria began to play, she spoke to the audience. 6 months ago, I stood on this stage for the first time. I was terrified and excited and hopeful. Tonight, I want to dedicate my performance to everyone who has a dream they are afraid to share. Your dreams matter. Your talents matter. You matter. As she began to play, Maria thought about how much her life had changed. She now had a recording contract and was working on her first album. She was studying at the conservatory and learning new techniques from master teachers. She had performed in concert halls across the country. But the most important change was not in her career or her income. The most important change was in how she saw herself. She was no longer a waitress who happened to play piano. She was a musician who happened to have worked as a waitress. The music filled the ballroom just as beautifully as it had 6 months earlier, but now Maria played with even more confidence and joy. She knew that her gift was valued and appreciated. She knew that her story had inspired other people to pursue their own dreams. In the audience, other hotel employees watched and listened with new hope. They wondered what talents they might have that they had never had the courage to share. They wondered what opportunities might be waiting for them if they were brave enough to step out of the shadows. As Maria's performance ended and the familiar sound of thunderous applause filled the room, she smiled and thought about the scared waitress who had walked onto the stage 6 months ago. That woman had been brave enough to take one small step toward her dream. Sometimes that is all it takes. One moment of courage. One willingness to share your gift with the world. One decision to believe that your dreams are worth pursuing. Maria's story became an inspiration to people everywhere who had talents they were afraid to reveal, dreams they were scared to pursue, and gifts they thought no one would value. She proved that extraordinary things can happen to ordinary people who are willing to step into the spotlight. and share what makes them special. The waitress who had once felt invisible had become a shining example of what is possible when courage meets opportunity and talent meets determination. Her music continued to touch hearts and change lives, one beautiful note at a time.